Hey everybody, it's me, Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I'm talking about a band by the name of Trotsky Icepick. This LA-based band has been around for many a year, and it all kind of started about maybe 41 years ago, and that's where my story starts, how I got into the band indirectly. And that started with this album. The Last LA Explosion came out in 1979. I've talked about this album many times. One of my favorite albums of all time. It's an album that changed the way I listen to music. It's pop, it's power pop, it's garage, it's psychedelic pop. It's amazing. Now, The Last continued for a few years, and their music started to change after this album and after the follow-up EP. They became a little more garagey, still just as melodic and just fantastic songs. I mean, Joe Nolte wrote some great songs. They had great band members, but Vitas Monterey, the keyboard player, really helped shape the sound. His keyboards, his flute was just fantastic on this record and beyond. But by the end of The Last, which was, I believe, about 82 or so, they were more garagey, more urgent, still just as wonderfully melodic. But then Vitas Monterey left the band, and he tried his hand at producing and putting together his own musical outfits and stuff. But one of the first things that really gave a sign on what direction Vitas was heading in was this compilation called Wharf Rat Tales. This is a collection that is produced by Vitas Monterey, but it's got a lot of great bands on it, including The Last. It's got some classic LA bands. Some of these bands came from the Paisley Underground, or some of the members, or from the punk scene. Like there's a band called the Urinals and a band called 100 Flowers. They're both essentially the same band, but two different directions. The Urinals were more punk, 100 Flowers were more post-punk. But lots of great stuff on there. This wasn't this cheery, happy pop. It was melodic, but it was challenging. There was some darkness to it, some shadow and light mixing together, and it felt dangerous at times, at least back then when I was checking out this album when it first came out. It wasn't exactly what I expected, but I loved it because it was more garagey, more psychedelic, more artsy. This compilation really showed the light and which direction that Vitas would go next. Now, Vitas formed a band called Danny and the Doorknobs with Kjell Johansson, who was the guitar player for 100 Flowers and the Urinals. And also on the first album, they had John Frank, who had played with The Last, and John Rosewall, who played with The Last, played bass on some of the songs on the album. They recorded the album in 1983, but in 1985, they released Poison Summer. Again, it was more angular, more influenced by post-punk than it was pop or power pop, anything like that. It was still nice, melodic, but it was very original. It was eclectic and eccentric. Again, the shadows and light. These are guys that not only wrote songs, they formed them. So they came out sounding very interesting and pretty much unlike The Last, but very much their own thing. Then in 1986, they released the album Poison Summer. Oh, wasn't that the name of the last album? Yes, it was. So back in their early days, they had decided that instead of having the same band name and different album names, they would have the same album name, and with each album, use different band names. So Trotsky Icepick is the band name they chose for this album, and that's the one that stuck. I think that was probably better commercially for them because people would never know how to find their records anyway. But this is a great album too. I think it's more focused, more direct. This album here features Vitas and Kjell and John Frank, formerly of The Last, and Jamie Lennon on keyboards. No relation to John or the Venice Brothers. But Trotsky Icepick, 1986, Poison Summer. 2 years later, out comes the album Baby. Again, Vitas and Kjell at the forefront there, but the drumming stool is taken by Jason Kahn, and John Rosewall, formerly of The Last, is on bass. Another great collection. Vitas handles pretty much the lead vocals. I mean, he's been the lead vocalist since the Danny the Doorknobs days, but surprisingly, by the next album, released in 1989, called El Kabong, Vitas actually started singing mostly backing vocals. He was still handling guitars and keyboards. Kjell was there. John Rosewall was there. And on drums was Hunter Crowley. And on lead vocals was John Tally Jones, who had been the lead vocalist of the Urinals and 100 Flowers. The band has always been really melodic, but they're not concentrating on trying to be a commercial pop band. They're doing their own thing, angular, very smart, very intelligent, great musicians with a vision that is really kind of hard to describe. Is it pop? Maybe. Is it post-punk? Yeah. Is it alternative rock? Oh, yeah, okay. Is it art rock? Yeah, okay. You could file it under anything. Just don't file it under punk or power pop or whatever. It's just a very unique band. And this was El Kabong. This came out in 1989. And remember how I told you that they were Danny and the Doorknobs in that first album, Poison Summer? Well, SST, the label they had signed to, released that first album. It has a different cover, but it is that Danny and the Doorknobs album that was originally recorded in 1983 and released in 85 and released on CD in 1989. So it's still under Trotsky Icepick as Danny and the Doorknobs in Poison Summer. That first album is definitely available on CD with a different cover. 1990, the band returns with another great album called The Ultraviolet Catastrophe. And this is the same lineup of Vitas and Kell and John Rosewall and John Telly Jones and Hunter Crowley. A great collection of songs. This is a band that continues sort of stretching their sound, trying new things. Each Trotsky Icepick album is very powerful in its own way and very unique, but they definitely now have their own sound, which doesn't sound like anybody else out there. I mean, does anybody remember like when Firehose was on SST and they were putting out these uniquely great, wonderful albums? Well, they don't sound like Firehose, but their albums are as unique and wonderful as those. Maybe even later period Minutemen, where it was just so creative and smart. Took another 3 years before Carpet Bomb the Riff came out. And this, of course, is still Vitas, Kell, John Telly Jones. But they have Mike Patton on bass, not the guy you're thinking of from Mr. Bungle and Faith No More. And then a guy named John, I can't pronounce his last name, on drums. So this was a new lineup from the last couple albums. And yet another great collection. What you need to do is you really need to investigate them. They make really fine albums. But this kind of was, for a while, the very last Trotsky Icepick album. Now, there was one that came out in 1994 called Hot Pop Hello, which is a great album. But what it is it's kind of just a collection of stuff that they hadn't released up to that point. I don't know if it was stuff that was left on the cutting room floor or stuff that maybe was released as compilation tracks. But whatever it is, it's a great collection. They have formulated their own sound, and they know how to get shit done. And even though this was a collection of things that were previously unreleased, it's still a great, great album. This was 1994, and then they disappeared. Surprisingly, in 2019, out comes a brand spanking new Danny and the Doorknobs album. So for the first time since that first album that came out in 85, this is really the second Danny and the Doorknobs album. Now, the lineup on this album is, of course, it's still Vitas and Kell, and but John Frank is back, a gentleman by the name of Tom Hofer, Tom Watson, John Telly Jones, of course, is there, John Rosewall is there, and Jamie Lennon's back. And this is a great collection. In fact, this was preceded by a 7-inch single, and this is available on vinyl. But since this is CD Junkie, I don't show vinyl. But the vinyl actually has a 7-inch with it, so it's a really good deal. So I recommend one, the other, or both. And, of course, it's on Poison Summer Records. So that is Danny and the Doorknobs from 2019. And if you thought that was surprising, 2019 also gave birth to I Haunted Myself, a brand new Trotsky Icepick album. Of course, Vitas, Kell, John Frank, Tom Hofer, John Telly Jones are all there. And former drummer Hunter Crowley produced the album. And there it is there also on Poison Summer Records. Something I have to tell you, I wouldn't lie to you. This Danny and the Doorknobs album called Jukebox in the LA River and this Trotsky Icepick album called I Haunted Myself, these are the best two albums that the band has been involved with. I mean, they've made some great albums. See, the thing about those albums, you can put them on now, and they're kind of timeless. They sound like they could have been recorded in the last 5 years or the last 5 weeks. There's nothing on those albums that says, hey, I'm 1989. And then you listen to these things, and it's just so mind-blowing to think that those great records that came out all those years ago, then they disappear for, 25 years? They come out with 2 different albums under 2 different band names, and it's the best full-length albums of their career so far. Now, the interesting thing that I understand is they now own the rights and the original master tapes to all the old things. So they're going to start going through, and they're going to start digitally remastering them and releasing them digitally. To my knowledge, they may not be available digitally now because they used to be on SST, and I don't think SST licensed their product out digitally. But maybe they've changed their mind. But I know that John Tally Jones and the other members of the Trotsky crew are remastering that, so that's very exciting, and I'm looking forward to that. And between you and me, Vitas Monterey and John Rosewall from The Last and Trotsky Icepick teamed up with a great drummer by the name of Danny Frankel. And they recorded an album, and I've heard a couple songs from it. How does any group of artists after 25 years come back stronger than ever? And the Petrified Max project with Vitas and John Rosewall and Danny Frankel, I've just heard a couple songs. I don't know when it's coming out, but I say you jot that down in your notebook, type it in on your phone, and wait for that, because it's just a fabulous release. And I say hop online. You can go to like Poison Summer, look up Poison Summer Records, go to Bandcamp or whatever, and buy the new Danny the Doorknobs, Jukebox in the LA River, and Trotsky Icepick, I Haunted Myself. I really recommend them. Now, don't think it's power pop. Don't think it's anything like that. It's just unique post-punk, art rock, whatever. It's just great. So I think you should check it out, and definitely check out these 2. If you like these 2, then just start going backwards. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for allowing me to talk about Trotsky Icepick, Danny the Doorknobs, and Petrified Max, and Vitas, and Kel, and John Tally Jones, and everybody else. And I really appreciate it if you would share, like, comment, subscribe. Throw me out there into the YouTube and Facebook algorithm universe, and see if we can generate more interest. But that's it for me, Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie.